Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, Russia isn't just drifting towards dictatorship, it's rebuilding it brick by brick. Moscow's secret police are constructing new prisons, new transport systems, and reviving the full Soviet architecture of repression. The FSB's prison empire is back, and this time they're preparing for mass arrest on a scale not seen in decades. As Vladimir Putin tightened his grip on power, his security services are quietly resurrecting a system that many thought had been buried with the Soviet Union, the Gulag. This time around, we break down Russia's return to the Gulag era and the terrifying machinery that's quietly roaring back to life. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the latest report to find out more.
Russia's State Duma is considering a controversial bill that would allow the Federal Security Service to operate its own detention centers for individuals accused of treason, espionage, terrorism, and extremism. Human rights activists warn this move could severely restrict legal access and judicial oversight, echoing practice from Soviet-era institutions like the NKVD and KGB. Deputy Andrei Kartapolov, a key proponent of the bill, insists the system will remain transparent and court-supervised. However, critics argue that the FSB, which is not accountable to public or legal bodies, could use these centers to detain political prisoners with little external scrutiny. Activist Ivan Astashin, a former political prisoner, fears the change will normalize lawyer restrictions, illegal searches, and document seizures. He cites existing FSB-controlled facilities like Lefortovo, where legal access is already tightly controlled. Supporters claim the bill enhances national security amid rising foreign threats, particularly from Ukraine. Detractors see it as a step toward institutionalized repression.
And now let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. Let's explore one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, the Soviet Union's Gulag system. These infamous labor camps, synonymous with oppression and suffering, reveal a chilling story of control and survival that still echoes today.
The Gulag system, short for Main Camp Administration, was a network of forced labor camps in the Soviet Union, operating primarily from the 1920s to the 1950s under Joseph Stalin's regime. These camps were central to the Soviet state's repressive machinery, detaining millions: political dissidents, intellectuals, ethnic minorities, and ordinary citizens accused of crimes like counter-revolutionary activities. Prisoners faced brutal conditions including starvation, extreme cold, and grueling labor in mines, forests, or construction projects like the White Sea Canal. The gulags were not just prisons but tools of economic exploitation and social control, designed to crush opposition and fuel Soviet industrialization. At their peak, over 2 million people were incarcerated across hundreds of camps. After Stalin's death in 1953, the system was gradually dismantled, but its legacy endures as a symbol of totalitarian oppression.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. If the latest legislative package sails through Russia's obedient State Duma, as it surely will, this won't just be a symbolic revival of Stalinist tools. It will be the physical reconstruction of a nationwide network of detention centers, transport systems, and FSB-controlled prison colonies purpose-built for the next phase of mass repression. At the heart of this new system is the FSB, Russia's modern-day secret police and the proud successor of the KGB. The new legislation, set to pass in July and come into force in January, gives the FSB powers it hasn't openly held since the darkest day of the Soviet security state. This isn't an accident. This is the deliberate rebuilding of a machine Putin has always admired. The return of Lefortovo prison of FSB control is a key part of the story. The infamous facility, with its cold corridors and five-wing design, has been Moscow's house of horrors since Tsarist times. Executions were carried out there in the Stalinist purges, and later it became the place where political prisoners and so-called enemies of the state were held in isolation. Officially, the FSB lost control of Lefortovo in 2005 when Russia made empty promises to the Council of Europe about separating investigative powers from detention facilities. But behind the facade, nothing really changed. The FSB quietly staffed the prison with its own people, its own interrogators, its own trusted insiders. The uniforms changed, the bosses didn't. It's easy to think of the Gulag as history, something locked in dusty books about Stalin's purges. But Russia is proving that the machinery of repression can always be repurposed, updated, rebranded. You didn't even need to call it a Gulag anymore, you just need the system in place, and Putin's system is nearly ready. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Andreas Umlen, analyst from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me again.
So it does seem like the Russian Secret Service is bringing back its prisoner empire once again. My question is, why now, and what are they hoping to achieve?
I think that is just a symptom of a general trend in that basically the institutions and the modus operandi of the old Stalinist system is brought back. And while in the West there may be many people who would say that the Russian Federation is different from the Soviet Union and the FSB is not the KGB, if you listen actually to the FSB officers, to the generals of the FSB and to Putin himself, they see themselves very much in the tradition of the Cheka, the GPU, OGPU, KGB, NKVD, and so on. So while there seems to be an institutional discontinuity between Soviet and post-Soviet Russian institutions, the culture is very much the same, and the people who are populating power positions today in Russia, they see themselves in the tradition of the Soviet terrorist regime, and that's why they're trying now to reinvent it or re-implement it, perhaps with new titles, with new justifications, but structurally very similar to what we saw already in the Soviet Union.
Right, and we've seen people being thrown in a slammer for what they presume are espionage, treason, or even coordination with foreign powers. How do these measures differ from your typical kind of martial law or measures during wartime? Like, for example, how do we differentiate that from how Ukraine is trying to counter their espionage activities?
Well, Russia is officially not in war. It's just carrying out a so-called special military operation. And so this is not something that is due to martial law. There's no martial law in Russia. I think the primary motivation for Russia to do that is that with the annexation of Ukrainian territories, the number of those who are suspected of being against the Russian state has risen, and the demands on the Russian state in terms of repressing dissent have risen, and that's why the state is now itself adapting itself to this new situation, and perhaps also preparing itself to annex further territories, maybe not only in Ukraine but also in other countries, and then to have their partisans and prisoners of war and civilians and dissidents and so on that need to be taken care of, especially political prisoners, most of them, de facto.
Right, so it does seem like it is targeting not just the outside forces, but also internal dissent as well for its own political gain. But do you think that this is going to go well for them? As we've seen time and again, usually the attempt at cracking down any dissent usually also gets a strong amount of pushback as well.
One would hope so, but the experience, frankly, of the last 3.5 years with the full-scale invasion in Ukraine is that the Russian people, the majority of the Russian people, may not support the war, but they go along with it, they participate in it, they support it, and they are sort of not active in any way to resist it. So it's a very frustrating situation. The Russian civil society is atomized, but also many Russians are actually now impregnated with propaganda. There was a poll recently where it turned out that Joseph Stalin is seen by most Russians by more than half of the Russian population as the greatest person in human history, even ahead of Vladimir Putin. And that is just something so bizarre, because Stalin has, of course, also killed millions of Russians and has suppressed Russian culture, Russian religion, Russian science, and so on. But nevertheless, he is very popular. So there's a certain psychopathology here that may then also support such a new Gulag system.
All right, so we can kind of assume that this is not just done so in a more logistical kind of way, but also it incorporates this propaganda to kind of go hand in hand in also cracking down on the psychological aspect of the Russian population.
Yeah, I mean, these totalitarian regimes, and now Russia is becoming more and more totalitarian again. They function by combining both propaganda and also material incentives on the one side with terror, or with the threat of terror, with, for instance, imprisonment, with torture, with terrorizing family members, and so on. And this sort of goes hand in hand, and then many people succumb to it. I've myself lived in East Germany and have experienced this sort of combination of terror or threat of terror with material incentives and promotion opportunities and so on. And this new structure, this new network, which is now being created, especially for the FSB, is apparently going to be a core part of this new de facto totalitarian system that Russia is now building.
It sounds very chilling indeed. And well, looking at the fact that they are constructing new complexes, it also shows that these mass arrests is going to be on a scale that the current system itself just cannot handle. And how is that going to impact the broader society with this whole kind of shift of dynamics and how many people are just going to be prosecuted?
Well, I mean, de facto, what I would call it is that if this is going to be implemented, that's going to be a concentration camp system that will sort of parallel the usual prison system, and that will create a new structure that is going to be reminiscent not only of the Stalinist system, but also of the Nazi system, and which is being especially created to take care of political dissent and to also imprison the various Ukrainians and Chechens and other people who are suppressed by Russia, and to have then this basically special prison system for political prisoners. So Russia is changing, not only in its domestic, not only in its foreign affairs, but also in its domestic affairs, but also in its structure, in the structure of the state. And this is all very worrisome. One can only hope that this whole structure will at some point collapse, because it also has to be financed, it has to be sustained, and the experience, of course, of the Soviet Union was that at the end it could not uphold this terror system.
And speaking of sustaining such a system, when we talk about like the Stalin system, like you mentioned, or the way the Nazis have been doing things, it's for the West, it almost sounds like a relic of the past. But in this day and age, especially with the global information age, is there going to be any difficulties or hurdles to even maintain such a system with it, be it international pressures or just a more kind of freely exchange of ideas?
I mean, this is all in a way anachronistic, but unfortunately not that much of an exception. There are similar tendencies in China. We have this old, if you want to call it that way, dictatorship in North Korea. There is a very bizarre regime in Turkmenistan. So this is not unique, but perhaps a trend also, is sort of a counter model to a democratic system that Russia is now implementing, and one can only hope that at some point it will be simply not viable, and then collapse as happened with the Tsarist system and the Soviet system before. And I think there's also a lot of illusion in the West about what the West can do to prevent Russia's collapse, because there are many people who are fearing Russia's collapse. But Russia is driving itself more and more into a collapse, among others with a Gulag system like that.
Right, like I mentioned, it's already driving themselves to a downward trajectory. Do you think that having to establish these type of system is going to be such a drain, be it in resources, be political capital? Eventually, will there be a critical point where things just cannot kind of return to the way it used to be?
Yes, there is what I see there as certain introvertness of the leadership that does not seem to understand anymore where the world is going, and that is becoming more and more radical in spite of the many disappointments that they should have had in the past with this course, with losing Syria. Armenia is leaving de facto the Russian space. Now the Iranian regime is in trouble. And Russia is creating for itself, for its own society, but also for its foreign image, more and more problems with its behavior. And I don't think that this can go on forever. The North Korean example, in a way, is perhaps a warning that this can go on for a very long time. But I would still make a distinction between Russian society and North Korean society, and hope that at some point this will all change.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight in helping us break all this down. And thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express. Appreciate it. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Bad news for Russian soldiers who struggle with military discipline on the Ukrainian front lines. President Vladimir Putin has signed a decree granting frontline military commanders the authority to arrest soldiers without court approval.
President Putin has authorized unit commanders in combat zones to detain soldiers for up to 10 days without a court ruling. This decree, signed in the fourth year of the Ukrainian invasion, allows for arrests in makeshift detention sites known as guard houses, facilities previously abolished in 2002 but revived in recent years for field use. Commanders can now conduct internal investigations and impose disciplinary measures within 2 days, bypassing distant military courts. The Defense Ministry argued that transporting soldiers to courts disrupts operations and strains resources. Offences warranting detention include unauthorized absences, substance abuse, and even the use of smartphones off-duty, a practice banned by legislation passed in July 2024 after soldiers used devices to document abuse and equipment shortages.
Tensions are boiling over in Armenia as Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan clashes with the powerful Apostolic Church amid claims of a foil coup. The arrest of Archbishop Bagrat Galstanyan, a leader of the protest movement Holy Struggle, has sent shockwaves through the country.
Armenia's political and religious crisis escalated dramatically when the National Security Service arrested Archbishop Bagrat Galstanyan, accusing him of plotting a coup. Galstanyan, a senior cleric and founder of the Holy Struggle movement, is alleged to have led a criminal group preparing terrorist acts to seize power during a period of national instability. Authorities claim the group had mapped out Yerevan and stockpiled thousands of incendiary devices. The crackdown follows months of mounting tension between Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and the Armenian Apostolic Church, which he accuses of ties to the former regime. Galstanyan's movement, born in response to Pashinyan's criticism of the church, has drawn large crowds, demanding the Prime Minister's resignation.
Russia has introduced new regulations requiring the use of the Russian language on certain public signs. Starting early next year, vendors will no longer be allowed to use signs like sale, closed, or open if native Russian equivalents are not displayed.
President Vladimir Putin has signed a law aimed at reinforcing the use of the Russian language in public life. Starting March next year, signs such as open, closed, and sale must appear in Russian, with any translations required to match in font, size, and color. The law introduced in 2023 was initially more sweeping, proposing restrictions on advertisements and brand names, but faced backlash from businesses and officials who called it excessive and legally flawed. Those provisions were ultimately dropped, leaving a narrower version focused on public-facing notices and signage. Violators will face fines ranging from 500 to 10,000 rubles, equivalent of up to $130, though the law exempts ads and registered trademarks.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.